At 70, I believed touch belonged to memory. My body had become a quiet house where no one knocked anymore. Then Gerald sat beside me in that hospital waiting room, and when his hand brushed mine, something I thought had died decades ago stirred awake. I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know he'd unravel everything I'd accepted about the rest of my life. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me share more stories like this. The fluorescent lights in the cardiac wing waiting area hummed with that particular frequency that makes time feel suspended. I'd been sitting in the same vinyl chair for 3 hours, waiting for news about my neighbor Dorothy, who'd collapsed that morning while watering her roses. We weren't close friends, but we'd lived next door to each other in Roanoke, Virginia for 6 years. When the ambulance came, I followed in my truck because her daughter was driving up from Greensboro and someone needed to be there. I was reading the same magazine article about container gardening for the 3rd time when he walked in. Tall, silver-haired, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose knees had logged a lot of miles. He wore work boots and canvas pants with paint stains, a flannel shirt rolled to the elbows. His face had the kind of weathering that comes from years outdoors, creases around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. He chose the seat 2 down from mine. Close enough that I registered his presence, far enough to respect the unspoken rules of waiting room geography. "Long day?" he asked after a few minutes, his voice low and warm. "Getting there," I said. "You?" "My brother-in-law." "Heart attack this morning. He's in surgery now. I'm sorry." "My neighbor." "Same thing, more or less," he nodded. We fell into silence again, but it felt different now. Shared instead of separate. An hour passed. The magazine had nothing left to offer. I set it aside and closed my eyes, thinking about Dorothy's roses, how she pruned them every spring with such precision. My late wife, Anne, had loved roses, too. She'd been gone 11 years, and I still sometimes turned to tell her something before remembering. "Coffee's terrible here, but it's hot," the man said. He was standing now, gesturing toward the hallway where the vending machines lived. "I'm making a run if you want anything. Black coffee sounds good." "Thank you." "Richard," he said, extending his hand. "Gary." His grip was firm, warm, brief. He returned 10 minutes later with 2 cups and a pack of peanut butter crackers. "Thought you might be hungry." "I'm always hungry when I'm anxious." We sat drinking bad coffee and eating crackers, talking in the way strangers do when circumstance has made them temporary companions. He told me he was a Finnish carpenter, semi-retired now but still taking small jobs when they interested him. Custom cabinets, built-ins, the kind of detail work that required patience. He lived in the Grandin village area, had moved to Roanoke 5 years ago from Lynchburg after his wife passed. "Needed a change," he said. "Couldn't be in that house anymore." I understood that completely. After Ann died, I'd sold our place in Richmond and moved here, to the Williamson Road area, where nothing reminded me of her except what I carried inside. "I teach music theory," I told him. "At Virginia Western Community College, part-time. Used to teach full-time at VCU, but after my wife died, I wanted something smaller." "What instrument?" "Piano, mostly." "Some composition." His eyes brightened. "My daughter plays." "Well played. She's busy now with work and kids, but she used to be serious about it." We talked about music, about his brother-in-law's stubborn refusal to see a doctor despite months of chest pain, about Dorothy's garden and the neighborhood cats that treated it like a personal resort. The conversation moved easily, naturally, filling the anxious space with something warmer. Around 8 o'clock, a surgeon came out and spoke to Richard. The news was cautiously good, stable. Recovery would be long, but possible. Richard's shoulders dropped 2 inches with relief. "Thank God," he said quietly. Dorothy's daughter arrived 20 minutes later. And shortly after that, a nurse came to tell us Dorothy was awake and asking for her. I stood to leave, feeling the stiffness in my back from too many hours in a chair. Richard stood too. I'm glad your neighbor's okay. Same about your brother-in-law. We shook hands again. This time, the contact lasted a fraction longer. I felt the calluses on his palm, the steadiness of his grip. Something passed through that touch, subtle as a change in air pressure. Maybe I'll see you around, he said. Roanoke's not that big. Maybe so. I drove home through the dark streets, past the old brick buildings downtown, and the bright signs of the newer developments pushing south. My house was quiet when I got there. It was always quiet. I'd grown used to it, the way you grow used to any persistent ache. But that night, heating up leftover soup and sitting at my small kitchen table, I kept thinking about the warmth of Richard's hand. The easy way he'd talked, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. I told myself it meant nothing. I was 70 years old. That part of life was over. I'd had my love, my marriage, my years of companionship. Anne and I had built a good life together, raised 2 kids, weathered the hard seasons, and celebrated the bright ones. When she died, I'd quietly accepted that I would live out my remaining years alone. I'd never told anyone, not even Anne, about the feelings I'd had in my 20s. The way I'd noticed men as much as women, maybe more. The crush I'd had on my college roommate that I'd buried so deep I'd almost convinced myself it was friendship. The shape of desire I'd carried in secret until I met Anne and chose the life that made sense, the life that was possible. I'd loved her. That was true and uncomplicated, but there had always been a room inside me I'd kept locked. Now, at 70, sitting alone in my kitchen, I felt that door rattle. 3 days later, I saw Richard again. I was at the Grandin Kroger, debating between 2 kinds of pasta sauce, when I heard his voice behind me. The one on the left's better. Trust me, I turned. He was pushing a cart with a bag of dog food and a bunch of bananas in it. You have strong opinions about marinara, I said. I have strong opinions about most things. Comes with age. We stood there grinning at each other like idiots. I put the left sauce in my basket. How's your neighbor? He asked. Home. Grumpy about her restricted activity, but improving. Your brother-in-law? Same. Complaining, which the doctors say is a good sign. We walked through the store together, not shopping so much as extending the encounter. He told me about the bookshelf he was building for a client. I told him about the student who'd just figured out chord progressions and was composing her first piece. At the checkout, he said, There's a chamber music concert at Jefferson Center Friday night. Small ensemble, but supposed to be good. If you're interested, my heart did something complicated. I'd like that, 7:30. I could pick you up, or we could meet there. Pick me up, I said, and gave him my address. He called that night. Not to confirm, just to talk. We stayed on the phone for an hour, conversation wandering from music to books to the ridiculous political ads flooding the local channels. When we hung up, I realized I was smiling. Friday came. I changed shirts 3 times, which was absurd. It was a concert, 2 men attending a public event. Perfectly innocent. But my hands shook slightly as I buttoned the blue Oxford Richard arrived at 7:15, wearing slacks and a sweater that brought out the gray in his eyes. He'd shaved carefully. I caught the scent of aftershave when he came to the door. You look nice, he said. So do you. The concert was beautiful. A string quartet playing Schubert and Brahms in the intimate hall. But I barely heard it. I was too aware of Richard sitting beside me, his arm occasionally brushing mine on the shared armrest. Every point of contact felt amplified, electric. Afterward, we walked to Billy's for dinner. The restaurant was warm and loud, insulated against the October chill outside. We ordered sandwiches and beer, sat in a corner booth, and talked until the staff started stacking chairs. I should let you go, Richard said finally, though he made no move to stand. I don't want to go. The words hung between us. His expression shifted, something opening. Neither do I. We drove back to my place slowly. He parked in front and turned off the engine but didn't get out. "Gary," he said quietly, "I need to tell you something." My chest tightened. Here it comes, I thought. The moment where he explains this was just friendly, that I'd misread everything. "I haven't felt this way in a long time," he continued, "since before my wife got sick. Maybe longer than that, if I'm honest. And I don't know what you're looking for, or if you're looking for anything at all, but I needed to say it." The relief was dizzying. I didn't think this could happen anymore. At my age, after everything, what? This, wanting someone, feeling like a nervous kid, he smiled. So I'm not imagining it? No. We sat in the dark cab of his truck, the street light casting shadows through the windshield. Then Richard reached across the console and took my hand. Not a handshake this time. A deliberate, unmistakable claiming. His palm against mine felt like the answer to a question I'd stopped asking. "Can I see you again?" he asked. "Yes." "Tomorrow?" "Yes." He squeezed my hand gently, then let go. I got out of the truck feeling lighter than I had in years. Inside, I didn't turn on many lights. I sat in my living room in the near dark, replaying every moment. The concert. The dinner. His hand in mine. At 70, I'd thought I knew the shape of my remaining years. Quiet, solitary, dignified decline into old age. But sitting there, my hand still warm from his touch, I realized I didn't know anything at all. Richard came over the next morning with coffee and bagels from Mill Mountain. We sat at my kitchen table, and the daylight made everything feel both more real and more fragile. In the dark of his truck, the confession had felt safe, cocooned. Now, in the ordinary Saturday morning light, we had to figure out what we were doing. "I've never done this before," Richard said. "Been with a man, I mean. I thought about it when I was younger. There was a guy in the Navy, but I never acted on it. I thought about it too, more than thought, maybe. But I married Anne and I loved her. That was real. My wife Patricia was real too. I don't want to dishonor that." "We're not," I said. "We're just living the lives we have now." He looked at me across the table, his eyes serious. "What do you want this to be?" I'd been awake half the night asking myself the same question. "I don't know. I just know I want to find out." We spent that Saturday together doing nothing remarkable. I showed him my small music room, the keyboard and the notebooks full of half-finished compositions. He told me about the workshop he rented on Williamson Road, showed me pictures on his phone of the pieces he'd built. We were like archaeologists, carefully excavating each other's lives. In the afternoon, we drove up to Explore Park and walked the trails. The trees were starting to turn, gold and red against the Blue Ridge backdrop. We didn't hold hands. We were still too uncertain, too new. But we walked close, our shoulders occasionally bumping. "My daughter knows I'm spending time with someone," Richard said. "I told her I met someone at the hospital. She seemed happy about it." "What did you tell her about me?" "That you teach music. That you're kind. That I like talking to you." He paused. "I didn't tell her you're a man. Not yet. Are you worried about her reaction?" "I don't know. She's liberal, open-minded, but it's different when it's your father." He kicked at a loose stone on the path. "Are your kids aware?" "I told them I've been seeing someone. My son said he's glad I'm not alone all the time." My daughter asked if it was serious. I said I didn't know yet. "Is it?" Richard asked. "Serious?" I stopped walking. We were on a ridge overlooking the Roanoke River, the water silver in the afternoon light. "It feels like it could be." He turned to face me fully. We were alone on the trail, no one in sight in either direction. Slowly, carefully, he reached out and touched my face, his palm against my cheek. I closed my eyes. His thumb brushed near my temple, gentle and deliberate. "I want this," he said quietly. "I want you." "But I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of being too old to start over. Of doing it wrong. Of my family not understanding." I opened my eyes. I'm afraid too. But you're still here. So are you. He let his hand drop. We stood there for a long moment, then continued walking. But something had shifted. We'd named it now. This wasn't just companionship or friendship. It was desire, possibility, risk. Over the next few weeks, we fell into a pattern. Richard came over most evenings after his workshop closed. Sometimes I cooked. Simple things like roasted chicken and vegetables. Sometimes we ordered takeout from the Thai place on Colonial Avenue. We'd eat and talk, then sit on my couch and watch old movies or listen to music. The physical progression was slow, almost painfully so. We were two men who'd spent decades in heterosexual marriages, who'd never navigated this particular territory. But gradually, tentatively, we learned. The first time Richard kissed me, we were on my couch watching Casablanca. He turned to say something about the cinematography, and instead he leaned in and pressed his lips to mine. It was brief, chaste almost, but it shattered something. When he pulled back, his eyes were uncertain. Okay? More than okay. We kissed again, longer this time. His hand found the back of my neck. I felt the scrape of his stubble, the warmth of his mouth, the way he tasted like the wine we'd been drinking. My whole body felt awake in a way it hadn't in years, maybe decades. We took it slow. At our age, there was no rush. Some nights we just kissed, learning the topography of each other's mouths. Other nights we ventured further, cautious explorers in unfamiliar land. The first time I felt his skin against mine, his chest bare under my hands, I almost wept with the strange joy of it. "You okay?" he'd asked, pulling back. "Yes, just overwhelmed." "Good overwhelmed. Very good. We never went to his place." He shared that he wasn't ready for that, wasn't ready to bring this into the space where he'd lived with Patricia. I understood. Anne's presence was lighter in my house because I'd chosen it after her death, but she was still there in photographs. In the piano she'd bought me for our 20th anniversary. In 100 small ways. One evening in November, Richard's daughter Sylvia called while he was at my place. He stepped into the other room to talk to her, and when he came back, his face was troubled. "She wants to meet you," he said. "She's coming to Roanoke next weekend, and she asked if we could all have dinner." "What did you tell her?" "I said I'd ask you." He sat down heavily. "I still haven't told her about us. About what this is. Do you want to?" He was quiet for a long time. "I don't know how. How do you tell your daughter that everything she thought she knew about you isn't quite right?" "You don't have to tell her anything yet. We can just have dinner. I can be your friend who teaches music." But Richard shook his head. "I don't want to lie to her, and I don't want to hide you." The dinner was at Carlos Brazilian Grill, neutral territory. Sylvia was 52, a nurse practitioner with her mother's eyes and her father's careful way of speaking. She greeted me warmly, shook my hand, seemed genuinely pleased to meet her father's new friend. The meal went well. We talked about her work, her teenage kids, the house she and her husband were renovating in Lynchburg. She asked about my teaching, seemed impressed when I mentioned I'd published several compositions years ago. Over dessert, Richard set down his fork. "Sylvia, I need to tell you something." She looked at him, curious but not alarmed. "Okay, Gary isn't just my friend. We're seeing each other. Romantically." The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds but felt longer. Sylvia looked at me, then back at her father. Her expression cycled through surprise, confusion, and then something I couldn't quite read. "You're dating?" she said finally. "Yes, but you're both men." "Yes." She sat back in her chair, processing. Richard's hands were clenched on the table. I wanted to reach over and take one, but I wasn't sure if that would help or make things worse. "How long?" Sylvia asked. "About 6 weeks." "And you're sure about this? You've never been with a man before." Richard's voice was steady. "I'm sure. I know it's unexpected, and I know it might be hard for you to understand, but this is real. Gary is important to me, Sylvia turned to me. And you? Were you married to a woman too? Yes, for 41 years. She died 11 years ago. Did you know you were gay when you married her? It was a fair question, though it landed hard. I knew I was attracted to men, but I loved my wife. I chose that life and I don't regret it. But I also spent a long time not being fully honest with myself. She nodded slowly, taking it in. I need to think about this. That's fair, Richard said. We finished the meal with strained small talk. Sylvia hugged her father goodbye in the parking lot, but the embrace was brief, uncertain. She nodded at me politely and drove away. In Richard's truck, he gripped the steering wheel and stared straight ahead. That could have gone worse, I said quietly. Could have gone better, too. She didn't reject you. She just needs time. He drove me home in silence. At my door, he finally spoke. I'm sorry if that was hard for you. It was hard for you, too. Yeah. He looked exhausted. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but saying it out loud to her made it so real. Do you regret telling her? He thought about it. No, I'm tired of hiding parts of myself. I did that for too long already. I kissed him goodnight, there on my front porch where neighbors might see. It felt like a small act of defiance and courage. Sylvia called Richard 2 days later. He told me about it that evening, sitting in my kitchen while I made pasta. She said she loves me no matter what, he reported. But she's struggling with it. She keeps thinking about her mom, wondering if I was unhappy all those years. What did you tell her? The truth. That I loved Patricia deeply. That our marriage was real and good. But that I'm also finally letting myself acknowledge something I pushed down for decades. He rubbed his face. She asked if I was happy now. I told her yes. Are you? He looked at me across the kitchen and his expression softened. Yes. Scared sometimes. Uncertain about a lot of things, but yes. Happy. I set down the spoon I was holding and went to him. He pulled me onto his lap, wrapped his arms around me, and buried his face against my shoulder. We stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in my small kitchen while the pasta water boiled. December came. We spent Christmas separately with our respective families, but exchanged gifts beforehand. Richard gave me a wooden music stand he'd built, walnut with delicate inlays. I gave him a book of Chopin nocturnes and a recording I'd made of myself playing them. I'll listen to this every night, he said. That seems excessive. I don't care. My daughter Jennifer called on Christmas Day. She'd been asking more. Questions about who I was seeing, and I'd been vague, not quite ready for that conversation. Dad, she said, I need to ask you something. Is the person you're seeing a man? My heart stopped. Why do you ask that? Because you're being weird and evasive, which isn't like you. And because I want you to know I don't care if it is. I just want you to be honest with me. I sat down. Yes, his name is Richard. How long? Since October? Are you happy? Very. Then I'm happy for you. Her voice was warm, certain. I wish you'd told me sooner. Did you think I'd judge you? I didn't know what you'd think. This is all new for me, too. Bring him to my place for New Year's, she said. I want to meet him. So we went to Richmond for New Year's Eve, to Jennifer's house in the museum district where she lived with her husband and 2 teenage sons. Richard was nervous in a way I'd never seen him, fidgeting with his collar in the car. What if they don't like me? He asked. They'll like you. What if I say something wrong? You won't. But they did like him. My grandsons, 16 and 14, were fascinated by his woodworking and spent an hour showing him videos of elaborate furniture builds they'd found online. Jennifer pulled me aside in the kitchen while Richard was absorbed in explaining mortise and tenon joints. He's wonderful, she said. And you're different, lighter. I am? You've been sad for so long, Dad. I'm so glad you found him. At midnight, Richard kissed me in front of my whole family, a quick press of lips that nonetheless announced everything. My grandsons cheered. Jennifer smiled, and I felt something inside me finally, fully relax. Driving back to Roanoke the next day, Richard reached over and took my hand. We drove like that for miles, fingers intertwined, the winter landscape sliding past. "I love you," he said, eyes still on the road. I'd known it, felt it. But hearing the words still made my breath catch. "I love you too. What do we do now?" "Whatever we want." He glanced at me, smiling. "At 71, I'm starting my life over." "That's ridiculous. That's beautiful." And it was. But I also knew the hard questions were still ahead. In January, Richard's lease on his workshop space ended. The landlord wanted to renovate and triple the rent, which wasn't feasible. Richard spent 2 weeks looking for a new space, but everything in Roanoke was either too expensive or too small. "I could set up in my garage," he said, frustrated. "But it's not insulated and I'd freeze half the year. We were at my place as we usually were." Richard spent most nights there now, going home only to check his mail and water his plants. We hadn't talked about making it official, but we were already functioning as a unit. "What if you worked here?" I said. He looked up. "Here. I have a garage too, and a basement. Both are heated. Gary, that's a big step. You're already here all the time. Living together and working in your space are different things, but the more we talked about it, the more sense it made. My garage was large, detached, with good light and electrical outlets. We spent a weekend clearing it out, moving my accumulated junk to a storage unit. Richard brought over his tools gradually, arranging them with the same precision he brought to his woodwork. By February, he was effectively living with me, though he still kept his house. We didn't talk about it explicitly. It just happened, the way so many important things do, through accretion rather than decision. One evening, working at his bench in the garage, he said, "I should probably sell my place. I was sitting nearby, grading student compositions. You don't have to, I know, but I'm never there. It's just sitting empty, and the mortgage is money I could be saving." He sanded a piece of cherry wood with careful strokes. "If I sell it, this becomes real in a way we can't take back. Are you afraid of that?" "A little." "Aren't you?" Truthfully, I was. Despite everything, despite the joy Richard brought into my life, there was still a part of me that felt like I was betraying something. The life I'd built with Anne, the person I'd been for 70 years, the assumptions I'd made about who I was allowed to be. "I spent my whole marriage to Anne keeping a part of myself locked away," I said slowly. "I was faithful to her. I loved her. But I also never let myself fully examine what I'd given up by choosing that life. And now I have a chance to live differently, and yes, it's terrifying." Richard set down the sandpaper. "Do you regret it? Marrying her?" "No, I had a good life with Anne. I have 2 children I adore. I don't wish that away." I met his eyes. "But I also don't want to spend whatever time I have left living in fear." He came over and kissed me, his hands dusty with wood particles. "Then I'll call the realtor tomorrow." The house sold quickly. Richard moved the last of his things into my place in March, and suddenly we were living together in an official, undeniable way. It required adjustments. Richard was tidier than me, bothered by dishes in the sink and newspapers left on the couch. I needed more alone time than he did, hours to sit at my piano and work through ideas without conversation. We had our first real fight in April over something trivial that spiraled. Richard had invited his brother-in-law and his sister over for dinner without asking me first. I felt ambushed, not ready to host, and snapped at him. He snapped back that this was his home too now, that he should be able to invite family over. "I just need warning," I said, my voice too loud. "I gave you 3 days' notice. I need more than that." We stood in the kitchen, glaring at each other, both too stubborn to back down. Then Richard laughed. "This is absurd," he said. "We're acting like children. You started it, very mature." But he was smiling. "I'm sorry. I should have asked first, not just announced. I'm sorry too. 3 days is reasonable notice. I was just feeling territorial. We met in the middle of the kitchen and held each other. The fight deflating as quickly as it had inflated. We're going to have more of these, Richard said against my shoulder. Probably. Think we can survive them? I think we have to try. The dinner with Richard's family went fine. His sister Marjorie was briskly polite, her husband quiet and pleasant. They didn't ask probing questions, didn't make the relationship a topic. Over dessert, Marjorie mentioned that Sylvia had called her, worried about Richard. She's having a hard time with this, Marjorie said carefully. The change, Richard's jaw tightened. I know. She'll come around. She just needs time. But time was the one thing we were acutely aware of not having in infinite supply. At 71 and 70, every day felt both precious and fleeting. In May, I had a health scare. Chest pain that sent me to the emergency room, convinced I was having a heart attack. Richard drove like a maniac, his face pale and set. It turned out to be severe acid reflux, embarrassing and anticlimactic. But the hours in the ER waiting for test results had been harrowing. Afterward, sitting in my living room at 2 a.m, Richard said, I can't lose you. Not now that I just found you. You're not going to lose me. We don't know that. We're old, Gary. Anything could happen. It was the unspoken fear we both carried. We'd found each other late. Might only have a handful of years together. It felt cosmically unfair. Then we don't waste the time we have, I said. He pulled me close. We sat like that until dawn, holding each other against the uncertainty. Summer came, hot and green. We fell into routines that felt like they'd always existed. Morning coffee on the back porch. Richard working in the garage while I practiced piano. Evenings walking through Fishburne Park or driving up the Blue Ridge Parkway to watch the sunset. In July, my son Matthew visited from Charlotte with his wife and kids. He'd been supportive when I told him about Richard, but we hadn't spent time together in person since then. I was nervous about how the visit would go, whether Matthew's acceptance would hold up under proximity. But he and Richard got along immediately, bonding over a shared love of terrible action movies and competitive grilling. Watching them argue about charcoal versus gas while flipping burgers, I felt something in my chest ease. Your dad's great, Richard said later. After Matthew's family had gone to their hotel, he likes you too. It matters to you. Their approval. Of course it does. They're my children, Richard nodded. Sylvia's still struggling. She's polite when I talk to her, but there's distance. She won't come visit. Give her time. What if time doesn't fix it? I didn't have an answer for that. In August, we took a trip to Virginia Beach, rented a small cottage near the shore. It was the first time we'd traveled together, the first time we'd been away from the routines that scaffolded our life. We walked on the beach at dawn, ate too much seafood, made love in the small bedroom with the windows open to the sound of waves. One afternoon, sitting on the sand, Richard said, I wish I'd known myself better when I was younger. What would you have done differently? Maybe nothing. Maybe I still would have married Patricia had Sylvia lived that life, but I would have known I was making a choice instead of just following the expected path. We did what we could with what we understood at the time. He took my hand. I'm grateful I get to do this now. With you. We watched the waves come in, the endless repetition, the patient work of erosion and renewal. Back in Roanoke, life continued. Richard's carpentry work picked up. He built a custom bookshelf for the library downtown, a set of cabinets for a doctor's office. I taught my classes, worked on a new composition for string quartet. We had dinners with friends, went to concerts, lived our lives openly. Sometimes people stared. 2 old men holding hands in the grocery store. 2 old men dancing together at the outdoor concert series in Elmwood Park. Once, a man in a parking lot muttered something ugly as we passed. Richard tensed, but I squeezed his hand and kept walking. Does that bother you? He asked later. Yes, but not enough to hide. In September, Sylvia called and asked if she could come visit. Richard was surprised but hopeful. She arrived on a Saturday, alone, her husband staying home with the kids. We had lunch at the River and Rail, kept the conversation light. Afterward, we walked through the center and the square galleries. Finally, at a coffee shop on Market Street, Sylvia said what she'd come to say. I've been angry, she told Richard. Angry that you kept this from me. Angry that everything I thought I knew about you and Mom turned out to be incomplete. Richard's face was pained. I'm sorry, but I've been talking to a therapist and I've been doing a lot of thinking. And I realized I wasn't really angry at you. I was angry that the world made you feel like you couldn't be honest, that you had to choose between being yourself and having a family. She looked at me, then back at her father. I don't want you to be alone, and I can see that you're happy with Gary, really happy in a way I don't think I've ever seen you. Richard's eyes filled. I am. Then that's what matters. She reached across the table and took his hand. I'm sorry it took me so long to get here. They held hands, and I looked away to give them privacy, watching the street outside through blurred vision. After Sylvia left, Richard was quiet for a long time. We went home and sat on the back porch watching the afternoon fade. Thank you, he said finally. For what? For being patient with me. With all of this. The mess of figuring it out. It's my mess too, he smiled. Our mess. Exactly. October came again, a year since we'd met. Richard made reservations at the restaurant where we'd had our first real date, bought flowers, the whole production, over dessert. He reached across the table and took my hand. I never thought I'd get to have this, he said. A second chance at love. At being fully myself, neither did I. I want more time. Decades more. We might not get that, I know. But I want it anyway. I squeezed his hand. Then we'll take whatever we get and make it enough. We drove home through the familiar streets, past the park where we'd first walked together, past the hospital where we'd met. Inside our house, our shared space full of both our lives blended together, we held each other in the quiet darkness. At 71 and 70, we were old men by any measure. Our bodies ached in ways they hadn't before. We took pills for blood pressure and cholesterol, had regular doctor's appointments, were acutely aware of our mortality, but we were also more alive than either of us had been in years. The next morning, I woke to find Richard already up, standing at the bedroom window watching the sunrise. I joined him, wrapped my arms around him from behind. What are you thinking about? I asked. How lucky we are. How unlikely this all is. Do you regret waiting so long? He turned in my arms to face me. I regret that we didn't have more time, but I don't regret the lives we lived before. They brought us here? That's very philosophical for before coffee. He laughed, kissed my forehead. Come on, I'll make breakfast. We went downstairs together, Richard's hand in mine. Through the kitchen window, the October light was golden, slanting through the trees in our small yard. The coffee maker burbled. The radio played something classical and complicated. And I thought about all the years I'd lived believing certain doors had closed forever. All the assumptions I'd made about who I was allowed to be at this age, in this body, with this history. I'd been wrong about so much. Richard set a mug of coffee in front of me, his hand briefly touching my shoulder as he passed. Such a small gesture, easy to miss. But I felt it completely, that simple contact, the way I'd felt his hand that first day in the hospital waiting room. At 70, I'd thought intimacy was over. I thought I knew the shape of my remaining years, the quiet diminishment ahead. But then his hand touched mine, and everything I thought I knew changed. We had breakfast together in our kitchen, making plans for the day, for the week, for whatever time we had. Two old men learning how to be young again, Two old men building something new from the materials of their complicated pasts. Two old men, finally, completely, undeniably alive.